The stars outside the viewport of the ESS Relentless were quiet that night. And that was the kind of quiet that made Lieutenant Commander Dara Voss uncomfortable. She stood at the bridge console with her arms crossed and her eyes locked on the long-range scanner screen, watching a small cluster of data points blink in and out near the edge of the Calorian Nebula, a dense and violet cloud of gas and stellar dust that most pilots avoided like a bad reputation. The year was 2247, and humanity had been flying between the stars for just over 40 years. Long enough to be known in the galaxy, not long enough to be respected. The Galactic Conclave had over 200 member civilizations, some of them ancient beyond imagination, and most of them looked at humans the way someone looks at a loud child who has just walked into a quiet library, with a mix of irritation, amusement, and the quiet hope that the child would soon leave. Humans were classified under observed status, which sounded polite, but meant very little. It meant the Conclave was watching, not welcoming. Dara had heard every version of the same speech from Conclave diplomats since she was a cadet. Humans were too aggressive, too unpredictable, too emotional, too quick to fight, too slow to think, and frankly too new to be taken seriously. She had stopped being bothered by it somewhere around her third deep space tour of duty. What bothered her right now was the signal. It had come in 40 minutes ago on a standard emergency frequency, the kind that every ship in the known galaxy was legally and morally required to monitor at all times. The signal was short, encoded in Valorian Imperial script, and it was repeating in a slow and desperate loop. Dara had run the translation 3 times because she did not believe the first 2 results. The message read, "Royal Shuttle Sela 9 under attack. Life support failing. All crew injured. Requesting immediate emergency response. Coordinates follow." She had immediately cross-referenced the Valorian Royal Registry and found that Shuttle Sela 9 was the personal transport of Princess Sarah of the Valorian Empire, the only daughter of Emperor Tyrell, the most politically powerful single figure in the entire Galactic Conclave. Valorian Empire was not just a member civilization. It was the backbone of the Conclave, the civilization that most of the others had built their alliances around for centuries. A distress signal from Princess Sarah was not a small thing. And yet when Dara had sent a priority query to the 6 Conclave vessels currently within range of those coordinates, she had received the same reply from all 6 of them within minutes of each other. Signal acknowledged. Response pending diplomatic protocol review. Estimated authorization window 48 to 72 hours. Dara had read that message 4 times and then set it down very carefully because she had the kind of temper that broke screens. 48 to 72 hours, and the shuttle's life support was failing right now. She turned around to face her bridge crew, 12 men and women from 4 different countries, all of them watching her with the particular expression that experienced crew members wore when they already knew what their commander was going to say and were just waiting for the word. Navigator Cho was already pulling up the route to the distress coordinates on the main screen without being asked. Chief Engineer Ramos had her comm unit open and was clearly already running power calculations. Dara looked at the scanner one more time, at the tiny blinking signal that was a person somewhere out in the dark, hurt and waiting for someone to come. She said, "All right, set a course for those coordinates, maximum speed, and tell engineering I want everything we have going into the engines." Senior Officer Kale, a tall Tharan with pale blue skin and 4 fingers on each hand, who had been assigned to the Relentless as a Conclave liaison 2 months ago, stepped forward from his station near the back of the bridge and said, "Commander Voss, I must advise that responding without Conclave authorization will create a significant diplomatic complication." Dara glanced at him and said, "Noted." Kale said, "The protocol exists for a reason. Rushing into the Calorian Nebula without proper authorization and without a coordinated response could—" Dara cut him off and said, "Kale, there is a person out there who is running out of air right now, and 6 ships closer than us that are waiting for someone to fill out a form before they decide whether she is worth saving. I am not waiting for the form. Kale was quiet for a moment, and then said very softly, and in a tone that suggested he was not entirely sure how to feel about what he was witnessing, "Humans are very strange." Dara said, "Yeah, we really are. Now strap in." The Relentless turned and accelerated hard into the dark. The Calorian Nebula looked beautiful from a distance. Great sweeping curtains of violet and gold light, enormous columns of gas lit from within by young stars still forming deep in their cores. Up close, it was something else entirely. The magnetic interference inside the nebula played havoc with navigation systems, and the dense gas clouds reduced visibility to almost nothing at all. The Relentless moved carefully through the outer layers, slowing to a speed that felt frustratingly cautious, but was absolutely necessary. The nebula had eaten faster and more confident ships than theirs. It took 2 hours to find the shuttle. When they finally picked it up on short-range sensors, it was worse than the signal had suggested. The Royal Shuttle was a beautiful craft, or it had been once, long and elegant in the Valorian style, built for comfort and ceremony rather than for combat. Now, it was drifting, badly damaged, one side completely torn open by what looked like weapons fire, slowly spinning in the grip of a gravitational drift that, if left uninterrupted, would eventually pull it toward the dense stellar mass at the nebula's core. 3 other ships, already dead and dark, drifted nearby. Attackers, Dara guessed, or possibly escort vessels that had tried to fight back and lost. Pilot Diaz said, "Life signs. The scanner is showing at least one person still alive inside the shuttle. Weak reading, sir, but it is there." Dara said, "One survivor." Diaz said, "Looks like it." Dara said, "Then we are not going home with an empty ship. Bring us alongside, and someone tell medical to get a team to the docking bay right now." Kale had moved from his station to stand just behind her again, and she could feel him watching, with an expression she could not quite read. It was not disapproval anymore. It was something more like genuine bewilderment. He said, "Commander, if that is truly Princess Sarah aboard that vessel, the political implications of what happens in the next hour are enormous." Dara said, "Significant, yes, I know that. But right now, I only care about keeping her alive long enough for the politics to matter." She reached up and keyed the ship-wide comm and said, "This is the commander. We are about to do something the rest of the galaxy apparently decided not to bother doing today. We are going to go and get someone who needed help and nobody came for. Do your jobs, and do them well." The response from the crew was immediate and quiet and professional, which was exactly what she had hoped for. There were no cheers or speeches, just people moving to their stations and doing what needed doing. Kale stood very still, at the back of the bridge, and watched all of it. The calm faces, the steady hands on consoles, the complete and total absence of hesitation, in a room full of people who were flying directly into danger for someone none of them had ever met. He had studied humans for 2 months, and thought he had understood them fairly well. He was beginning to suspect he had not understood them at all. The Relentless locked onto the shuttle and began moving into dock. Dara did not look at the conclave ships still sitting at a safe distance on her long-range scanner. She had already forgotten about them completely. The docking clamps caught the Royal Shuttle on the 3rd try. That was 2 tries more than Dara wanted, but the shuttle was still spinning from the damage it had taken. And matching the rotation, while also fighting the nebula's interference, was not a simple job even for a pilot as good as Diaz. The moment the clamps held, the Relentless groaned under the added weight, and the gravitational pull from the stellar core tugged at them both. Chief Engineer Ramos came over the comm immediately and said, "Commander, I need you to know that we are inside the gravity threshold now. We have a window of approximately 22 minutes before the pull becomes too strong for our engines to break free." Dara said, "Understood. 22 minutes is plenty of time." Ramos said, "With respect, Commander, it is not plenty of time." Dara said, "I know. Get us more time." She heard Ramos make a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a curse, but was somewhere between both, and then the line clicked off, and Dara could already hear the hum of the engines rising in pitch as more power was pushed into them. She pulled on her emergency suit as she walked down the corridor toward the docking bay. Not a full EVA suit, just the kind rated for vacuum exposure and mild fire, which she hoped would be more than enough. Behind her came Sergeant Yale Maury from the ship's small marine detachment, and Dr. Pereira from medical, and 2 more crew members whose names she reminded herself to learn properly after this was over. The docking bay connector tube between the 2 ships was intact, but the hatch on the shuttle side had to be cut open because the locking mechanism had been fused shut, possibly from the weapons fire, possibly from the heat the shuttle had taken on its long drift near the stellar mass. Maury had the cutter through it in under 3 minutes, which was fast work in an emergency suit with shaking hands. The inside of the Royal Shuttle was dark and hot and full of smoke. Emergency lighting in pale orange strips along the floor was the only illumination, and it made everything look like the inside of a furnace. Dara moved forward immediately, stepping over debris and pieces of the shuttle's interior that had been thrown around by the impact of the original attack. The shuttle's main cabin was designed for royalty: wide seats, decorative panels, delicate materials, and all of that now looked like wreckage. They found the first body near the front of the cabin, one of the royal guards, armored and motionless. They found 2 more near the rear. Dr. Pereira checked each one quickly and shook her head each time. Then Maury called from the back and said, "Commander, here." Princess Sarah of the Valorian Empire was wedged into a narrow maintenance alcove at the very back of the shuttle, behind a section of collapsed wall panel that had probably saved her life by shielding her from the worst of the internal explosion. She was tall, as Valorians were, nearly 2 meters, with the silver-gray skin of the high noble bloodlines, and the large luminous eyes that Valorian physiology gave them for seeing in the low-light environments of their homeworld. She was wearing the remains of a formal ceremonial robe that had been beautiful once and was now torn and scorched. She had a deep wound along her left side, a burn across her right arm, and she was barely conscious. Her eyes found Dara, and she said something in Valorian. Her voice was weak, but her gaze was sharp even now. Dara did not speak Valorian, but her translation unit picked it up and rendered it in a flat electronic voice that said, "You are human." Dara said, "Yes, and we need to move right now, so I'm going to pick you up and carry you, and I need you to hold on if you can." The translation unit rendered this in Valorian, and the princess's eyes widened slightly. She said something else and the unit translated, "The protocol for handling a member of the imperial family requires." Dara said, "I am sure it does. Hold on." She pulled the princess free of the debris, got one arm under her shoulders and one arm under her knees, and stood up. Sarah made a sharp sound of pain. Dara said, "I know. I'm sorry." She turned and walked fast back toward the hatch, navigating the wreckage by memory now, because the smoke had thickened and visibility was nearly nothing. Behind her, Dr. Pereira was already ahead of them, having moved through the smoke faster, preparing the medical team on the other side. Maury was behind Dara with a light, cutting through the worst of the smoke with a narrow beam. Ramos came over the comm and said, "Commander, 12 minutes now. The pull is increasing faster than expected. We need to leave." Dara said, 30 seconds. She was already at the hatch, ducking through the connector tube with the princess held close. And then they were through, and the docking bay door sealed behind them, and Dr. Pereira was already reaching for Sarah with gloved hands and a medical scanner. Dara set the princess down on the emergency stretcher that had been laid out, and said, "She has a wound on her left side and a burn on her right arm, and she has been in that heat for a long time. Take care of her." Pereira said, "Already on it." Dara turned and ran back toward the bridge. Behind her she could hear the hum of the engines rising even higher, as Ramos pushed the power systems toward their limits. On the bridge, Diaz had her hands tight on the manual controls, and Cho was feeding her course corrections every few seconds. Dara dropped into her command seat and said, "Ramos, give me everything." Ramos said, "Giving you everything, Commander, but I want it on record that the engine housing on number 3 is not going to be happy about this. Dara said, "Noted. Diaz, break us free." Diaz said, "Breaking free." What happened next was not elegant. The Relentless groaned and shuddered as the engines fired at full power against a gravitational pull that had no interest in letting them go. The ship did not smoothly glide away from the stellar threat. It lurched and shook, and for about 4 seconds it did not move at all. Then it moved. Slowly at first, then faster, and then it punched through the threshold, like a cork out of a bottle, and the gravitational drag fell away behind them, and suddenly everything was smooth again. The bridge was very quiet for a moment. Then Navigator Cho looked at his display and said, "We are clear." And that was that. Dara leaned back in her seat and let out a long breath and said, "Good. Someone make sure our guest is comfortable, and then I want full damage reports from every station." On the medical bay monitor beside her command console, she could see the vital sign readout for Princess Sarah. Weak, but stable. Kale appeared at her shoulder and stood quietly for a moment, watching the data on the monitor. Then he said, "I have been an observer on 12 different ships in 14 years of service with the Conclave Diplomatic Corps. 6 of those ships were military vessels with decorated crews." Dara said, And I have never seen anything like what just happened." Dara looked at him and said, "We went in, we got her, we came out. That is all it was." Kale was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That is not all it was. But I am not sure I have the words for what it actually was yet." Dara said, "Let me know when you figure it out." She turned back to her console. Somewhere below decks, in a warm medical bay, a princess from the most powerful civilization in the galaxy was breathing clean air for the first time in hours. Nobody on the Relentless made a big deal about it. Princess Sarah spent the first 18 hours aboard the Relentless, mostly asleep. Dr. Pereira had sealed the wound in her side, treated the burn on her arm, and loaded her with enough medicine to make a comfortable recovery possible. Though she had noted in her report that Valorian physiology was close enough to the files in the ship's medical database that standard treatment was workable, which was fortunate. When Sarah woke properly on the second day, she was sitting up in the medical bay with her long silver fingers folded in her lap, looking at everything around her with the calm and precise attention of someone who had been trained from birth to assess new environments without showing what she was thinking. Dr. Pereira had sent a message to the bridge that their guest was awake, and Dara had come down when her shift ended. She knocked on the frame of the medical bay door, which she was fairly sure was not a Valorian custom, but seemed polite anyway. And Sarah looked at her with those large, pale eyes and said in careful standard, "You are the one who carried me." Dara said, "Yes, I am Commander Dara Voss. Welcome aboard the Relentless." Sarah said, "I am told the ship sustained damage in the rescue." Dara said, "Nothing we cannot fix." Sarah said, "I am also told that no other vessel responded to the distress signal before you arrived." Dara said, "That is correct." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Why did you come?" It was a simple question, but the way she asked it suggested she was genuinely uncertain of the answer, not performing confusion, but actually puzzled in a way that seemed almost uncomfortable. Dara thought about the question for a second, and then said, "Because you needed help, and you sent a signal asking for it. That is the whole reason." Sarah said, "There were conclave vessels closer to me than you were, vessels with crews that were better equipped and better authorized." Dara said, "I know." Sarah said, "And you came anyway?" Dara said, "Yes." Sarah said, "Why?" Waiting felt wrong. Sarah looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that Dara could not fully read, and then she said, "I do not understand that answer." Dara said, "I know. Get some more rest, and we will figure the rest out when you feel better." What neither of them knew yet was that the galaxy was already watching. The emergency broadcast system of the Royal Shuttle had been running automatically from the moment the distress signal was sent. A Valorian security feature that recorded and transmitted all data from the ship's exterior sensors until the vessel was formally recovered or destroyed. This meant that everything the shuttle's sensors had recorded from the outside, the arrival of the Relentless, the docking, the departure from the gravity well, had been broadcasting continuously to Valorian Imperial monitoring stations. Those stations had forwarded the feed to the Imperial network, and the Imperial network had 37 affiliated news channels across 14 civilizations. By the time the Relentless had cleared the Calorian Nebula and set course for the nearest Conclave way station, the footage of a single human ship flying into a collapsing stellar environment to pull a royal shuttle out of a death drift had already been seen by approximately 900 million people across those 14 civilizations. By the time Sarah was sitting up and eating a meal in the medical bay, that number was somewhere over 4 billion. The footage was not dramatic in the way that battle footage is dramatic. There were no explosions visible from outside, no obvious violence, just a battered mid-class human warship moving with obvious urgency into a purple and gold nebula, while 6 other ships sat at a distance and did nothing. But that contrast was exactly what made it impossible to look away. Everyone who watched it understood what they were seeing: the ships that stayed still and the ship that moved. On the bridge of the Relentless, the communications board had been lighting up for hours, and Cho had stopped trying to answer each one individually, and was now routing them into a queue. Messages from Valorian diplomatic offices, from Conclave news services, from private citizens, from researchers, from at least 3 different alien governments, all of them asking variations of the same basic question: who are these humans, and why did they do that? Dara came back to the bridge after visiting the medical bay and looked at the queue and said, "How many?" Cho said, "Currently 647 messages, and the number is going up." Dara said, "Route everything official to Kale, and tell him to handle it. He is the diplomat, not me." Kale had in fact already been handling it, and was currently standing at his station with 3 separate comm channels open at once, speaking in fluent Conclave standard to someone at the Valorian Imperial Court, pausing to acknowledge a message from a Tharan academic institute, and simultaneously reading a formal inquiry from the Conclave Diplomatic Assembly, with an expression that had stopped being overwhelmed about an hour ago, and had settled into something that looked almost like satisfaction. Dara watched him for a moment, and said, "You look like you are enjoying yourself." Kale said, "Commander, in 14 years of diplomatic service, I have never been at the center of this much galactic attention. I am choosing to view it as an opportunity." Dara said, "An opportunity for what?" Kale said, "For humanity." He turned to look at her properly then, and said, "You should understand what is happening right now. The footage of this rescue has done something that decades of diplomatic negotiations have not managed to do. It has made the Conclave look at humans and feel something other than mild condescension." Dara said, "What are they feeling?" Kale said, "I believe the word in most languages would be shame, and after shame usually comes the need to do something about it." In the days that followed, as the Relentless made its way toward the way station, Sarah began to move around the ship. At first she only went to the observation deck, where she would stand at the viewport for long periods, looking at the stars. But then she started appearing in other places: the mess hall during meal times, the engineering corridor where Ramos had a habit of working on repairs in the early hours, the small crew lounge where people gathered after shifts, to talk, or play games, or simply sit in quiet company. She watched everything. She watched the way the crew argued loudly about small things: which route was better, which meal option was worse, whose turn it was to reset the calibration on the secondary scanner, and then laughed about it immediately after. She watched Engineer Tomas, who had a bad leg from an old injury, be offered a seat by 3 different crewmates in the space of 10 minutes, without any of them making a show of it. She watched Dara sit down at a table with junior crew, and eat the same food they were eating, and listen to them talk. She watched Mori teach a hand exercise to one of the younger technicians to help with wrist fatigue from working the control panels. These were small things individually. But Sarah had grown up in an imperial court where every action had a calculated purpose, and every kindness was a form of currency. Watching people simply help each other because it was easier than not helping, watching people simply be decent without keeping score, felt genuinely foreign to her. It was not that Valorians were unkind, they were not, but their culture had formalized everything, layered courtesy over warmth until it was hard to tell where the performance ended and the feeling began. On this ship, there was no performance at all. What she saw was exactly what was there. On the fourth day, she found Dara alone on the observation deck during a quiet hour, and said, "I have been watching your crew." Dara said, "I know. Most of them have been trying not to stare at you, which I appreciate." Sarah said, "They are not what I was told humans were like." Dara said, "What were you told?" Sarah said, "Aggressive, selfish, tribal, dangerous, unpredictable." Dara said, "Well, we can be all of those things." Sarah said, "Yes, but you are also other things, and nobody mentioned the other things." Dara looked out at the stars for a moment and said, "People rarely do." The Valorian Imperial Court was the most beautiful place Dara Voss had ever seen, and the most uncomfortable place she had ever stood. It was built from a material called stellar stone, a pale mineral that had been quarried from dead moons and then grown into shape over centuries, using a technique that no one outside the Valorian Empire fully understood. The walls were high and curved and smooth, and they caught the light from the enormous amber sun outside, and scattered it in warm patterns across the floor, in a way that made every hour of the day look like late afternoon. The court itself was vast, large enough to hold 500 people easily, with tiered balconies above, and a long ceremonial floor below, leading to the emperor's dais. Dara was standing in the middle of all of it, in her dress uniform, which she had pressed herself that morning, because she did not trust anyone else to press it correctly, and she was deeply aware that every single one of the several hundred Valorians watching her from the balconies and the floor was doing so with the intense focused attention that Valorians gave to things they found genuinely interesting. She had not expected to be nervous. She was a little nervous. Emperor Tyrell was tall even for a Valorian, easily 2.5 meters, with the formal silver and white robes of the imperial household, and a quiet authority that filled the room without him having to do anything dramatic to put it there. He looked at Dara the way you look at something you are still deciding how to categorize. Then he spoke, and the translator at Dara's ear rendered it as, "Commander Voss, you have returned something to this empire that cannot be measured in any standard of value we possess." Dara said, "I did what needed doing, sir. I am glad she is safe." The emperor said, "My daughter tells me you carried her." Dara said, "It was faster than asking her to walk." There was a pause across the entire room, and then quietly, Emperor Tyrell made a sound that his translator rendered as a laugh. It was a small thing, but the effect on the room was immediate. The rigid ceremonial tension broke just slightly, and Dara felt the watching eyes shift from assessment to something warmer. Sarah was standing to the emperor's right in formal robes, her injuries healed now, her posture perfect. But her eyes found Dara's, and there was a look in them that was not the careful formal gratitude of a princess performing a ceremony. It was the look of someone who wanted to say something real, but was currently in a place where real things had to wait. The ceremony went on for another 2 hours. There were speeches and formal acknowledgments, and the presentation of the Valorian Star of Conduct, which was a medal that Dara was fairly sure she would never wear, but accepted with appropriate gravity. There was also a formal notification from the Conclave Diplomatic Assembly that the incident review of the 6 ships that had failed to respond to the distress signal was underway, which Kale, standing at the edge of the room, received with an expression of professional calm that did not fully hide the satisfaction beneath it. Afterward, in a smaller and quieter room, Sarah brought Dara tea and sat across from her without ceremony and said, "I want to tell you something." Dara said, "All right." Sarah said, I have been thinking about what you said on the ship, that waiting felt wrong, and I have been trying to understand it for 2 weeks now. Dara said, Did you figure it out? Sayra said, I think I understand the words, but I do not think I understand where it comes from. In our culture, we have duty and honor and formal obligation. We help because the structure tells us to help, but you helped because something inside you said it was wrong not to, and I do not know what that is. Dara thought about this for a moment and said, I think it is just something that gets built into you, not from training or rules, just from living, from watching people around you help each other over and over until it becomes the only thing that makes sense to do. Sayra said, Humans have a very violent history. Dara said, Yes. Sayra said, And yet you are also this. Dara said, Yes. I know that seems like a contradiction. Sayra said, It does not seem like one anymore. I think it might actually be the explanation. She was quiet for a moment, turning her teacup slowly in her hands, and then she said, May I ask you something difficult? Dara said, Sure. Sayra said, Do you know why 6 ships did not come for me? Dara said, I know what they told me. Diplomatic protocol, authorization windows, bureaucratic reasons. Sayra said, Yes, but do you know the real reason? Dara said, I think those were the real reasons. I think it was genuinely easier to follow the procedure than to make a hard call. And when the stakes are high enough, a lot of people choose the procedure because it means the responsibility belongs to the process and not to them. Sayra said, Yes, and you did not choose that. Dara said, The procedure would have let you die. The procedure was wrong. Sayra looked at her for a long moment, and then said, My father wants to formally propose an alliance between the Valorian Empire and Earth. Not just observed status, a full bilateral alliance, with seat rights on the conclave floor. Dara said, That is a significant thing. Sayra said, Yes, there are people who will oppose it, powerful people. People who have benefited for a long time from humanity being kept at the edge of the table. Dara said, I imagine there are. What neither of them said out loud, but both of them understood, was that those people had already begun to act. 2 days earlier, Kale had come to Dara with a security report that had been quietly forwarded to him through a back channel he had maintained since his time on another posting. The report was short and alarming. It suggested that a faction within the Conclave's administrative body, one that had opposed human integration for decades, had become aware that the Valorian alliance proposal was coming, and had decided that the simplest way to stop it was to remove the 2 people most responsible for making it possible. Kale had used the word assassination, which was not a word Dara had been expecting to deal with on what was supposed to be a diplomatic visit. She had immediately consulted with Imperial Security, and had immediately spotted the problem. Imperial Security was thorough, trained, and deeply formal. They were looking for complex threats, hidden signals, disguised weapons, unusual energy readings. Dara had spent an hour thinking about the problem differently, and had asked one question. What is the dumbest, most direct way someone could try this? The answer, once she started looking for it, had not been hard to find. A maintenance contractor with forged credentials had been scheduled to work in the corridor outside the small reception room 3 hours after the ceremony ended. The same room where Sayra had just brought Dara tea. The contractor was now in Imperial custody. Sayra had been told, carefully and briefly. She was quiet about it for a moment, and then she said, You found it because you thought like an attacker. Dara said, I thought like someone who wanted to get the job done with minimum complication, which is the same thing. Sayra said, Our security teams did not find it. Dara said, Your security teams were looking for something sophisticated. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is the simple one. Sayra said, Is that something they teach humans? Dara said, It is something history teaches you. When you have been fighting long enough, you learn that the complicated plan usually fails, and the simple plan usually does not. Sayra was quiet for a moment and then said, I think the galaxy has been underestimating you for a very long time. Dara said, Probably. But that has its advantages. The Galactic Conclave Grand Assembly had been held in the same orbital station above the planet Velhoris for 300 years. The station was enormous, built to accommodate the delegations of over 200 civilizations simultaneously. And on the day that Sarah's proposal was scheduled to be heard, it was fuller than it had been in decades. Delegations that normally sent junior representatives had sent their senior ones. Species that rarely attended in person had sent live delegates instead of recorded statements. The halls and corridors were crowded with beings of every description, tall and short, armored and robed, scaled and feathered and smooth-skinned. All of them moving through the wide passages toward the main assembly chamber with the particular energy of a crowd that knows it is about to witness something that will be discussed for a long time afterward. Dara was not inside the chamber. She was in a small waiting room off a side corridor, sitting in a chair that was designed for a species with a different body shape, eating a food bar from her jacket pocket and reading a maintenance report from Ramos about the No. 3 engine housing, which had in fact expressed considerable unhappiness about the escape from the Calorian Nebula, and was now requiring a level of attention that Ramos described in her report as ungrateful given what we asked it to do. Kale knocked and entered and said, "The session begins in 20 minutes. Dara said, "I know." Kale said, "You are not nervous?" Dara said, "I am not the one giving the speech. Sarah is. I am just here in case something goes sideways." Kale said, "And if nothing goes sideways," Dara said, "then I go home and get my engine fixed." Kale looked at her for a moment, with the expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was deciding whether to say something or not. And then he said, "Commander, I want you to know that what you did in that nebula, and what you did afterward in the Imperial Court, those things have genuinely changed what is possible here today." Dara said, "Sarah changed what is possible here today. I just flew the ship. The ship when no one else would. That is not the same as just flying the ship." Dara looked at him for a moment, and then nodded once, which was as close as she generally got to accepting a compliment. Inside the assembly chamber, the session opened with the standard formal procedures that conclave sessions always began with: registration of attendance, confirmation of quorum, acknowledgement of the agenda. Then the floor was given to the Valorian delegation. Syra stood at the central podium in the full formal attire of the Imperial House, the silver and white and gold that the Valorian royal family had worn for public occasions for over 1,000 years. And she looked out at the assembled representatives of the galaxy, and was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke. She began with the facts of the attack on her shuttle, straightforward, precise, without drama. She described the distress signal, the 6 ships that received it and waited, and the 1 ship that did not wait. She then described what had been revealed since, that the attack had been organized by a network of interests within the Conclave's own administrative body, interests that had spent decades quietly ensuring that certain species and civilizations were kept away from real power within the Conclave structure, not through open argument, but through the slow accumulation of protocol, procedure, and the bureaucratic weight of acceptable loss. The chamber was very quiet. Syra said, "I am alive today because one human commander looked at a protocol and decided the protocol was wrong. I am going to ask this body to decide something today, but before I do, I want to be clear about what I am really asking. I am not asking you to reward humanity for a single act. I am asking you to decide whether this organization believes that the right thing to do is to respond when someone is in danger, or whether the right thing to do is to wait for authorization." She paused and let that sit in the room for a moment. Then she said, "The Valorian Empire formally proposes the elevation of humanity to allied status within the Galactic Conclave, with full seat rights, full voting participation, and full inclusion in all future treaty structures. And alongside that proposal, I am introducing the Accord of First Response, which would require every conclave member vessel to answer emergency distress signals without waiting for authorization review, because a person running out of air cannot wait 48 to 72 hours for a committee to decide whether they are worth saving." The vote on the Allied status proposal passed. It was not unanimous. There were holdouts, mostly from civilizations whose political positions within the conclave had benefited from humanity being kept at the edges. But the margin was large, and it was clear from the chamber that the holdouts knew the outcome before the count was finished. The accord of first response passed by an even larger margin. The network of conclave administrators connected to the assassination attempt and to the original attack on Sarah's shuttle was already being unwound by a joint imperial and conclave investigative body that Kale had helped to assemble over the previous 2 weeks. It would take time. These things always did. But the thread had been pulled, and there was no putting it back. Dara heard the results in the waiting room from Kale, who came in with an expression of carefully contained triumph, and told her the numbers. She said, "Good. When does the next shuttle leave for the way station?" Kale said, "The Emperor has requested a formal dinner this evening to celebrate. You are expected to attend." Dara said, "How long is the dinner?" Kale said, "Valorian formal dinners traditionally last 4 to 5 hours." Dara said, "I will be there for 2, and then I am going back to my ship." Kale said, "I will pass that along diplomatically." Sarah found Dara before the dinner, in the corridor outside the assembly chamber, in the 20 minutes of relative quiet that came after a large event, when the crowds were moving but not yet gone. She said, "We won." Dara said, "You won. It was your speech." Sarah said, "It was your ship." Dara said, "Our ship." Sarah smiled, which was the first time Dara had seen her do it without something ceremonial surrounding it, and it looked like a real thing, an actual feeling showing on an actual face. Of conclave liaison for the new Human Alliance portfolio. It means I would work directly with Earth's representatives on the formal integration process. Dara said, "Are you going to take it?" Sarah said, "Yes. I have been to your ship and eaten your food and watched your people. I think I would like to understand humans better." Dara said, "We are a lot." Sarah said, "Yes, but you are also worth understanding." At the dinner, which Dara attended for exactly 2 hours and 4 minutes before excusing herself, the conversation among the conclave's assembled diplomats kept returning to the same question. Not the political question of what human integration would mean, but the simpler and stranger question of why humans were the way they were. A Tharan scholar who had been studying human history for 15 years gave a short informal summary to anyone who would listen, describing the long record of human beings doing impossible things for each other. The rescues, the sacrifices, the stubborn refusal to leave people behind, even at enormous personal cost. He said, "We kept looking for the explanation, for the evolutionary advantage, for the cultural programming, for the rational calculation, and we kept not finding a clean answer. And then we realized the answer might simply be that humans decided to be this way long ago and collectively, and then they kept deciding it, generation after generation, until it became so deep in them that they do not even think of it as a decision anymore." He paused and looked around the small group and said, "They just call it what you do." Back on the Relentless, 2 days later, Dara was in her command chair reading the engine report from Ramos, who was personally offended by the damage and had written 4 pages about it, when the long-range scanner lit up with a new contact. Cho said, "Distress signal, Commander. Unknown origin. Weak signal. Bearing 274 by positive 11. Dara looked at the contact for about 2 seconds. Then she said, "Set a course." Nobody asked why. Nobody hesitated. The Relentless turned toward the signal and accelerated into the dark, exactly as it had before, and exactly as it would again. Some things do not need explaining. They just need doing.